The silence in the Duke of Blackmore's study was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from dust motes dancing in the thin afternoon light and the scent of old leather and disapproval. Selina Abbott felt it pressing on her skin, cold and clammy, a perfect match for the silk of the gloves her aunt had insisted she wear. The gloves were a size too small, pinching the fine bones of her hands, a constant, nagging reminder of her position, trussed up, presented, and utterly without agency. She stood a few feet behind her aunt's chair, her gaze fixed on a point just over the Duke's shoulder, a map of the county, its rivers and forests rendered in delicate, faded ink. It was safer than looking at the man himself, and far, far safer than looking at the document resting on the polished expanse of his mahogany desk. That paper was the reason for the silence. It was the reason for the too tight gloves, the borrowed dress that smelled faintly of her cousin's cloying perfume, and the frantic, week-long preparations that had culminated in this horrifying tableau. Her aunt, Lady Carmody, finally broke the quiet. Her voice, usually a brittle, chirping thing, was coated in a thick, sweet layer of deference that Selina knew to be entirely false. As you can see, Your Grace, it is a most equitable arrangement. A trifle unconventional, perhaps, but we are all modern people here, are we not? Selina fought the urge to flinch. Equitable, the word was a slap. She knew what the paper said. She had seen her aunt drafting it late one night, her pen scratching across the vellum like a rat in the walls. It was a settlement. Lady Carmody, a woman whose appetite for the card table was matched only by her spectacular lack of skill, had managed to lose a sum to the Duke that made Selina's blood run cold. A sum that could ruin them, strip the threadbare gentility from their name, and leave them with nothing. And so, her aunt had devised a solution. She had no more land to mortgage, no jewels of worth that were not paste. She had only one disposable asset left, her niece. The document in Lady Carmody's looping, self-important script proposed to settle the entirety of the debt. In exchange, Selina Abbott, spinster, aged 24, would be conveyed to the Duke of Blackmore's household. The word servitia was used, but it was a thin, transparent veil. The intent lay coiled beneath it, ugly and venomous. She was not to be a governess or a housekeeper. She was to be a collateral, a payment in flesh and bone. The Duke of Blackmore, Crispin, had not moved for a full 5 minutes. He sat behind his desk, a man carved from the same granite as the cliffs his castle was built upon. He was not handsome in the way of the dandies who flocked to her aunt's dismal parties. His face was all harsh angles and uncompromising lines, a jaw that looked as though it had been set against a gale-force wind and never relaxed, and eyes the color of a winter sea. He had a reputation for being cold, for being ruthless, in business and politics, for suffering no fools, and right now, those frigid gray eyes were fixed on the paper. He had not once looked at Selina. To him, she was not yet a person. She was a clause in a contract, a name in a ledger. The crime was that she was being sold. The humiliation was that he had not even bothered to inspect the goods. Unconventional, the Duke finally said. His voice was low and resonant, with a gravelly edge that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. It was not a voice for drawing rooms. It was a voice for giving commands on a battlefield or a storm-tossed deck. He picked up the paper, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were something soiled. He read it again, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately, down the page. Selina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel her aunt's smug satisfaction radiating from her chair. Lady Carmody believed this was a masterstroke. But Duke was a bachelor, his household notoriously devoid of a woman's touch since his mother's passing years ago. He was known to be a particular. What better solution for a man like that than a quiet, well-bred and utterly powerless companion, offered up with no messy emotions or tedious negotiations, A date settles the matter entirely, her aunt pressed on, misinterpreting his silence as consideration. And it provides the girl with a situation. She is quite capable, biddable. You will find her no trouble at all, your grace, biddable. The word for a horse that did not need to be broken. The Duca's gaze finally lifted from the paper, but it did not land on Lady Carmody. It moved past her across the 2 yards of worn carpet and settled, for the first time, on Selina. It was not a casual glance, it was an assessment, sharp and penetrating. He took in the borrowed dress, the pale, strained face, the hands clenched so tightly at her waist that the knuckles were white. He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes before she could school it into the proper meekness. He saw the faint smudge of ink on her right index finger. A ghost from the household accounts she managed for her aunt, with thankless precision. He noticed things. His father had taught him that the world was a series of transactions, a marketplace of appetites and weaknesses. People were assets or liabilities. Love was a fiction for poets and fools. A man's strength was in what he did not feel. For 35 years, Crispin had found this to be an entirely accurate, if bleak, assessment of the world. It had served him well, insulating him from the messy, unpredictable world of human connection. He had built walls of ice and granite around his life, and they had kept him safe. But as he looked at the young woman standing in the gloom of his study, he felt a crack appear in the ice. He saw the document her aunt had written, a piece of casual, familial cruelty that was breathtaking in its audacity. And then he saw the woman herself, standing there, being sold like a prize sow, and in her eyes he did not see a victim begging for rescue. He saw a prisoner of war waiting for the inevitable. He had seen such documents before. In his role as a magistrate, he had seen men and women trapped by debt, by circumstance, by the casual cruelty of those who held power over them. But he had never seen it enacted in his own study, with a woman of gentle birth as the currency. The cold fury that rose in him was an old familiar friend. It was the same fury he had felt as a boy, watching his father humiliate a tenant for a late payment. It was the same fury that had driven him to rebuild the Blackmore fortune, not for the wealth itself, but for the power to never be at another man's mercy, and to never, ever, place anyone at his. He looked from Selina, back to her aunt, who was now preening, a fat, self-satisfied cat, and he made a decision. With a slow, deliberate movement, Crispin brought his hands together. The sound of the paper tearing was shockingly loud in the silent room. Once, twice. He ripped the document into quarters, then eighths, letting the small, white pieces drift from his fingers onto the gleaming surface of his desk like a bitter snowfall. Lady Carmody gasped, a strangled, indignant sound. Your Grace. What is the meaning of this? The Duke ignored her. His eyes were still on Selina. He watched the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders, which had been hunched in anticipation of a blow, straightened by a fraction of an inch. He saw the flicker of disbelief, then confusion in her gaze. He rose from his chair. He was a tall man, and his height, combined with the severe cut of his black coat, made him an intimidating presence. He walked around the desk, his boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug, and stopped a few feet in front of her. He was close enough now that she could see the silver threads at his temples, the fine lines etched around his eyes. He smelled of rain and cold stone and something else, something clean and sharp like winter air. He had her aunt's full attention now, and the attention of every ancestor staring down from the portraits on the walls. He had the attention of the world, it seemed. But he spoke only to her. His voice, when it came, was quiet, stripped of the earlier gravelly command. It was just a voice. A man's voice. They seem to have neglected an introduction, he said, his gaze holding hers. I am the Duke of Blackmore. He inclined his head slightly. And you are? The question hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into a churning sea. He hadn't asked her aunt. He hadn't looked at the scraps of paper. He was asking her. He was acknowledging her as a separate entity, a person with a name, not just a line item in a sordid negotiation. Selena's throat was tight. Her own name felt strange on her tongue, a foreign thing she had not had cause to use with any expectation of being heard. "A Selena," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "A Selena Abbott, Your Grace." "A Selena," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He gave a short, decisive nod, as if he had just confirmed a vital piece of information. Then he turned his head, and the full Arctic force of his displeasure fell upon Lady Carmody. "A madama," he said, and the single word was laced with so much ice it could have frozen the room solid. Your debt is a matter of public record. You will find it has been cancelled. Consider it a fee for this educational afternoon. Now get out of my house." Lady Carmody's face, which had been a mask of smugness, crumpled into outrage and confusion. "The arrangement." There is no arrangement," the Duke stated flatly. There is a woman who has been insulted in my home, and there is a guest who has overstayed her welcome. I suggest you remedy the latter before I am forced to have you removed." The threat was unmistakable. Lady Carmody, for all her bluster, was a creature who understood power. She scrambled to her feet, her face mottled with fury. She shot Selena a look of pure venom, a look that promised retribution. Then, with a strangled sob of fury, she gathered her skirts and swept from the room. The sound of the great oak door slamming shut echoed through the hall. And Selena was left alone, standing in the center of the Duke's study with the man who had just torn up the contract for her life. The silence that returned was different now. It was not heavy and suffocating. It was light, airy, and terrifyingly full of possibility. He had not saved her. He had simply refused to buy her. What happened next was a mystery, a blank page on which anything could be written. Crispin returned to his desk, his movements economical and precise. He swept the torn scraps of paper into a silver tray. He did not sit. He stood leaning against the desk and regarded her with that same unnerving, analytical gaze. "Miss Abbott," he began, and the formality was both a comfort and a new kind of wall. My apologies for the theatricality of that scene. Your aunt's methods are as crude as her card-playing." Selena found her voice, surprised at its steadiness. You have nothing to apologize for, Your Grace. You were the offended party." A flicker of something? A surprise? Amusement crossed his face? An interesting perspective. Most women in your position would be dissolving into hysterics or effusive gratitude. "I am not in a position, Your Grace," she replied, the words coming out before she could stop them. A position implies a degree of stability. "I am in a vacuum." That finally earned her a real reaction. The corner of his stern mouth twitched. It was not a smile, not even close, but it was a deviation from the granite stillness. "A vacuum. Yes. That is an apt description." He paused, his gaze turning inward for a moment. "I find myself in a similar situation, albeit one of my own making." He pushed away from the desk and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening grounds of his estate. "Miss Abbott, I am about to be exceedingly rude and dispense with all social niceties. I do this not to offend you further, but because I am a man who has very little time and even less patience for games. May I speak plainly? I would prefer it, Your Grace," she said, and she meant it. She had lived her entire life swaddled in the suffocating cotton of polite fictions and veiled cruelties. Plainness felt like a luxury. Very well," he turned back to face her. "I have a problem. According to the terms of my late maternal uncle's will, I must marry before my next birthday, which is in 2 months' time. If I fail to do so, the trust that funds this estate, the trust that pays the wages of 500 souls and keeps this village from starving, will revert to a distant cousin who thinks farming is a hobby for sentimentalists." But Selena could hear the weight beneath the words. The pressure. The duty. "I have no intention of marrying for affection," he continued, his voice flat. Ah, the women of my circle are, for the most part, interested in my title and my fortune, and I am interested in neither their conversation nor their company. I require a duchess, a partner, someone who understands that this is a role, a job, a contract of mutual benefit. I had been planning to make a sensible, albeit uninspired, choice next month in London. Ah, he paused, and his gray eyes locked onto hers again. And then your aunt, in her infinite vulgarity, presented me with an alternative. A woman of good birth, education, and demonstrably sound temperament, under duress. Selina's blood went cold all over again. Your Grace, you cannot be suggesting. I am not suggesting what you think, he said sharply. I am not your aunt. I do not trade in people. I am, however, a pragmatist. You need a safe harbor, a home, a position that your aunt cannot touch. I need a wife who will not bore me to tears, who will not fill my house with simpering fools, and who will understand the nature of the bargain. He was offering her another contract. A different kind of sale, perhaps, but a sale nonetheless. From her aunt's cage to his. It might be a larger, more gilded cage, but it was still a cage. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing insults, and managing the wreckage of her aunt's life, had forged a core of steel within her. She had been biddable for far too long. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage like a shield. Before I answer to a proposition that has not yet been fully made, Your Grace, you will tell me the truth. All of it. I do not bargain with half a story. He raised an eyebrow. The granite facade seemed to crack a little more. He had expected compliance, or fear. He had not expected terms. What truth do you require? A duchess. That is not all you need, is it? When you looked at me, you saw the ink on my finger. You saw a manager of accounts. I have seen the state of my aunt's ledgers. I imagine a man who allows a debt of that size to be accrued at the card table is not overly concerned with his own household finances. Your estate is vast, but is it solvent? Is it well run? Or are you like my aunt, drowning in debts of a different kind? It was an outrageous impertinence. She was accusing a duke, one of the wealthiest men in England, of being a poor manager. She was prying into his affairs with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She expected to be thrown out on the spot, to have his earlier chivalry evaporate in a puff of aristocratic outrage. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a new, startling intensity. It was the look of a scientist who has just discovered a new species, a creature far more complex and interesting than he had first supposed. Then he did something that shocked her, more than his anger would have. He gave a short, harsh laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was genuine. God help me, he said, more to himself than to her. She has the audacity of a field marshal. He met her eyes, and for the first time, the chill in his was replaced by a flicker of something that looked almost like respect. You are correct, Miss Abbott. On all counts. My father taught me how to make money, but not how to manage it. He saw it as a vulgar preoccupation. This estate, it bleeds, slowly but constantly. My steward is loyal, but old and overwhelmed. The ledgers are a masterpiece of chaos. I spend my days putting out fires, and my nights dreading the next one. He was confessing to her. A stranger, a piece of human wreckage washed up in his study. The confession changed everything. It shifted the balance of power in the room from one of absolute monarchy to something approaching a negotiation between equals. He was not just a powerful duke, offering a deal. He was a man with a problem he could not solve alone. Now it was her turn to set the terms. The reverse rescue had begun. Though neither of them would have put such a name to it, he had pulled her from the fire of her aunt's making. Now she was considering whether to walk into his and see if she could put it out. If I were to consider this arrangement, she began slowly, choosing her words with care, there would have to be conditions. Would expect nothing less, he said, his tone dry. "A first," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. I will not be a prisoner in this house. I will have the freedom of the estate and the village. I will not be a decorative object, locked away until needed." "Agreed," he said instantly. "A second, I will not perform affection. This is a partnership, as you said, a business arrangement. There will be no pretense of a love match, for the benefit of gossiping neighbors. We will be civil, we will be allies, but we will not lie." He nodded. That was my fondest hope." "Agreed." "A third," she said, and this was the most important one, the one that made her heart pound. "If I am to be your duchess, then I will be your duchess, in fact, not just in name. The household will be my domain. Not just the menus and the linens. Your Grace, the ledgers, the accounts, the hiring and dismissal of staff. I will have full authority. I will answer to you, and only to you, but I will not have my decisions questioned or undermined by a steward who feels his territory is being invaded." She had laid her cards on the table. It was a breathtaking gamble. She was, in essence, demanding the keys to his kingdom. Crispin stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, and Selina felt her courage begin to waver. She had overplayed her hand. She had mistaken a moment of pragmatism for a genuine opening. He would laugh at her, call her an impertinent upstart, and send her on her way with a few coins for her trouble. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Abbott. I have learned the value of a good contract." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He walked back to his desk, not to sit, but to brace his hands on it, looking down at the polished wood. He was considering her, weighing her words, her audacity. He was weighing her. The current steward, Mr. Hobbs, has served my family for 40 years. He said, "He is a good man, but he is of the old school. He sees numbers as a necessary evil, not a tool. He will resist. AA will win him over," Selina said, with a confidence she did not entirely feel. Or I will replace him." Another one of those harsh, rusty laughs. "I have no doubt that you would." He looked up, and his eyes were clear. "The decision made. Your terms are acceptable, all of them." He straightened up and extended a hand across the desk. Not for her to kiss, but to shake. It was the gesture of one businessman to another. Selina looked at his hand. It was large, strong, and unadorned. A working man's hand, incongruous on a duke. Taking it felt like another momentous step, a crossing of a threshold from which there would be no return. Her own hand, small and trembling slightly, was engulfed in his. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly gentle. "We will have my solicitor draw up the papers tomorrow," he said, his voice all business once more. "A marriage settlement that protects your interests as much as mine. You will have your own funds, your own autonomy. You will never be at the mercy of another person's charity again. Not your aunt's, and not mine." He released her hand, but the warmth of his touch lingered. "I will have rooms prepared for you here at the castle," he continued. "It is better you do not return to your aunt's house. I will send a footman to collect your belongings. I have very few." "Your Grace," she said quietly. "A few books, a change of dress. Everything else I am wearing is borrowed." The statement hung in the air between them, a stark reminder of the world she was leaving and the one she was entering. He gave a curt nod. We will remedy that." He seemed about to say something else, something more personal, but he checked himself. The walls were already going back up. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, will see to you. I have estate matters to attend to." It was a dismissal. The bargain was struck. The terms agreed upon. The brief, startling moment of connection was over. He was the Duke of Blackmore again, and she was all. What was she? His fiancée of convenience. His new accountant. The solution to his problem. As she followed the silent ramrod-straight Mrs. Gable from the study, Selina glanced back. The Duke was standing at the window again, his back to the room. a solitary, imposing figure outlined against the twilight. He had not saved her, he had hired her, and she had just accepted the most important and most dangerous position of her life. The cold house of Blackmore was now her problem to solve. The castle was a labyrinth of echoing corridors and rooms shrouded in dust sheets, ghosts of a life that had long since departed. Mrs. Saplia Gable, a woman who seemed to be held together by whalebone and disapproval, led Selina to a suite of rooms in the east wing. They were spacious, with tall, mullioned windows overlooking a neglected rose garden, but they were achingly cold. No fire had been lit in the hearth, and the air held the damp, stony chill of a place long unloved. "Ah, His Grace said you would require things," Mrs. Gable said, her tone making it clear. She considered this an immense imposition. She looked Selina up and down, her gaze lingering on the simple cut of her borrowed dress. "A seamstress will be sent for in the morning. Until then, these were the late duchesse." Her Grace was of a similar size. She opened a vast cedar-lined wardrobe, and the scent of lavender and thyme wafted out. It was filled with dresses of silk and velvet, gowns in shades of cream and rose and dove gray. They were beautiful, but they felt like a costume for a part Selina did not know how to play. To wear them would be to try and step into a dead woman's shoes. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Selina said, her voice quiet but firm. That is very thoughtful, but I would prefer to wait for the seamstress. I will not be needing a gown this evening." The housekeeper's thin lips tightened. She had expected gratitude, perhaps even a fawning deference. She had not expected quiet refusal. "Are you wish, Missa?" The Missa was pointed, a reminder that Selina was not yet the Duchess, and in Mrs. Gable's eyes, likely never would be. Left alone, Selina did not explore the grand rooms. She walked to the hearth, and with hands that were surprisingly adept, laid the kindling and logs that were stacked in a basket nearby. Using the flint and steel from the mantelpiece, she coaxed a small flame to life. It was a domestic, practical skill, one she had learned out of necessity in the drafty, penny-pinching household of her aunt. She sat on the floor before the fledgling fire, hugging her knees to her chest, and watched the flames lick at the dry wood. She was the Duchess-to-be of Blackmore. The thought was so absurd, so fantastical, that it bordered on hysteria. She had traded one form of servitude for another, a grander one, to be sure, but servitude nonetheless. But as the fire grew, pushing back the chill in the room, a small, stubborn ember of determination began to glow within her. She had set her own terms. She had demanded authority. This was not her aunt's house, where she was a ghost in the background, her work invisible and unthanked. This was a challenge. Blackmore was not just a cold house. It was a vast, intricate puzzle, and the ledgers were the key. The next morning, she did not wait to be summoned. She rose early, dressed in her one remaining, serviceable day dress, and made her way to the estate office. It was a small, cluttered room near the kitchens, smelling of pipe smoke and damp wool. Mr. Hobbs, the steward, was exactly as the Duke had described him, a man in his late 60s, with a florid face, kind but watery eyes, and a general air of being perpetually overwhelmed. He looked up in astonishment as she entered. "Miss Abbott, His Grace did not say to expect you." "His Grace is a busy man, Mr. Hobbs," Selina said with a calm smile. "I, however, am not. Taria, I hoped you might allow me to look over the household accounts. I have some experience in the matter, and I find that idle hands are the devil's workshop." His face clouded with suspicion. "The accounts?" That is my work, Miss of course," Selina said soothingly, "and I have no doubt you are a master of it. But a fresh pair of eyes can often be a help, can it not? Perhaps I might spot a tradesman's error you have been too occupied to notice. Think of me as your temporary unpaid clerk." She was careful to frame it as helping him, as being subordinate to his authority. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. She knew she could not win by force. She had to win by competence. Reluctantly, he gestured to a towering stack of leather-bound ledgers on a side table. "Ayaz, you wish, miss. But you will find them all in order," Selina knew, with the certainty of a mathematician looking at a flawed equation, that they were not. For the next week, the estate office became her world. She did not start by correcting or criticizing. She started by organizing. She sorted the chaotic piles of invoices, receipts, and correspondence into neat stacks. She requested fresh ink, new nibs, and blank paper. She sharpened pencils. She dusted surfaces that had not seen a cloth in years. Mr. Hobbs watched her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. She did not complain. She did not demand. She simply worked. Then she opened the first ledger. It was, as the Duke had predicted, a masterpiece of chaos. Entries were scrawled in the margins. Sums were carried over incorrectly. There was no clear system for tracking expenditures against income. It was the work of a man who hated details, who ran the estate on a foundation of habit and handshake deals. It was honest, she suspected, but it was disastrously inefficient. She began her work, not in his ledger, but in a new one. She had procured patiently, line by line. She began to build a new set of books from the wreckage of the old. She worked late into the night, long after the rest of the castle had gone to sleep, the only light in the east wing coming from her window. Crispin saw it. From his own study, across the courtyard, he saw her light burning like a lone star in the vast, dark edifice of his home. He had expected her to make demands, to complain about the cold rooms, the surly housekeeper, the impossible task he had set her. She had done none of those things. She had simply gone to work. He found himself making excuses to walk past the estate office. He would see her bent over the ledgers, a smudge of ink on her cheek, her brow furrowed in concentration. She never noticed him. She was entirely absorbed in her task, in the world of numbers and logic that she was wresting from the chaos. One evening, he entered his study to find a single sheet of paper laid neatly on his desk. It was from her. It was not a request or a complaint. It was a summary, in her neat, precise hand, of the estate's quarterly expenditure on hay for the stables. At the bottom, she had written a simple, devastating analysis. By consolidating their purchases with a single supplier and buying in bulk before the winter, they could save nearly 30%. She had even listed 3 potential suppliers in the next county, complete with their current prices. It was brilliant. It was simple. It was something he and Hobbs had never once thought to do. He looked at the paper, at the clear, irrefutable logic of it, and felt that same jolt he had felt in the study when she had demanded his honesty. This was not just a woman who could balance a checkbook. This was a woman with a mind like a steel trap, a mind that saw patterns and possibilities where he saw only problems. The next evening, he walked into the estate office. Selina was there, as he knew she would be, her supper tray untouched beside her. The lamp was smoking, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. "That lamp is insufficient," he said without preamble. Selina looked up, startled. Your Grace, I did not hear you. You are going to ruin your eyes," he continued, ignoring her formality. He carried a heavy, brass and green glass lamp, the kind used for fine drafting work. He set it on her desk, the clean, bright, steady light immediately banishing the shadows. This is better." She stared at the lamp. It was a small thing, a simple act of consideration. But in the cold, impersonal world of Blackmore, it felt like a bonfire. Thank ye, Your Grace," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It is not a gift, Miss Abbott," he said, his tone brusque, as if embarrassed by his own thoughtfulness. "It is an investment. I cannot have my chief financial officer going blind." He gestured to the paper on his desk. "Your analysis of the hay expenditure was astute. It was simple arithmetic, Your Grace, perhaps. But no one else has thought to do it in 20 years. Ed." He paused, looking at the neat stacks of paper, the newly organized shelves. The sense of order she had already begun to impose on the small, cluttered room. Mr. Hobbs, tells me you are a tireless worker. A Mr. Hobbs is a kind man, but he is resistant to new methods. He is loyal. A. Crispin corrected gently. And he is afraid. Afraid of being made redundant. Afraid of a world he no longer understands. I have no intention of replacing him, Selena said. I intend to make him my ally. He knows the land and the people. I know the numbers. Together, we could make this estate profitable for the first time in a generation. He looked at her, truly looked at her. And for a moment the Duke of Blackmore was gone, and there was only Crispin, a man bearing an impossible weight. Do you truly believe that is possible? He asked the question raw and unguarded. She said with utter certainty. Blackmore is not broken, Your Grace. It is merely asleep. It needs to be woken up. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken things. He was the Duke. He was the master of this vast, cold castle. But in that moment, he felt as though she were the one in command, and he was the one being offered a chance at redemption. Then I suggest you get some rest, Miss Abbott, he said, his voice returning to its usual formal distance. Awaking a sleeping giant is exhausting work. He turned and left, leaving her bathed in the bright, steady glow of the new lamp. Selena watched him go, her heart beating a little faster. The Duke had given her a lamp, but what he had really given her, she realized, was a glimmer of trust. And in the cold house of Blackmore, trust was a warmth more precious than any fire. The thaw came, not as a sudden flood, but as a slow, almost imperceptible melting at the edges. It began with Mr. Hobbs. After a fortnight of watching Selena work, of seeing her treat him with unwavering respect, while simultaneously and inexorably reorganizing his entire world, he finally capitulated. He appeared one morning with a cup of tea for her, and a question about a disputed pasture boundary. She had put aside her ledgers, listened intently, and by cross-referencing his memory with an old tithe map she had unearthed in the library, she found a solution that had eluded him for months. From that day on, he became her most devoted lieutenant, his deep knowledge of the Estada's history now allied with her sharp, modern mind. The staff followed suit. Mrs. Gable's icy disapproval began to crack when Selena, noticing the housekeeper's painful limp, quietly arranged for the doctor from the village to call, paying for it out of her own small, newly acquired personal allowance. She did not make a show of it, she simply saw a need and met it. The maids, who had been whispering about this strange, quiet Amissa, who spent all her time with dusty books, began to see a woman who remembered their names, who asked after a sick child, who noticed a frayed apron and found a replacement from the linen stores. She was not trying to win them over, she was simply being herself. Kindness, she had learned in her aunt's house, was a currency that could not be hoarded. It only had value when it was spent. Crispin watched it all, a silent, solitary observer. He saw the way the servant's posture changed when she entered a room, the fear replaced by a quiet respect. He heard the distant, unfamiliar sound of laughter from the kitchens. He noticed that the fires were always lit now, the dust sheets gone, the windows clean and sparkling. Flowers from the greenhouse, long neglected, began to appear in small vases on the hall tables. The house was breathing again. Selena was waking it up. His own life began to shift in small tectonic ways. He found himself altering his daily route through the castle, not for efficiency, but on the off chance he might cross her path. Their conversations, which had been confined to the estate office and brief, formal reports, began to lengthen. He found her one afternoon in the long gallery, standing before a portrait of a woman with sad, gentle eyes and a cascade of dark hair. "Ah, my mother, he said from the doorway. Selena did not startle. She was very beautiful. She loved this house, Crispin said, coming to stand beside her. She tried to fill it with light. After she died, my father, he preferred the shadows. It was easier. It is always easier to let the dark in, Selena said softly. It is keeping it out that requires the effort. He looked from his mother's portrait to the woman standing next to him, the woman who was quietly, methodically, letting the light back into his home. Unplanned and unspoken. In the late afternoons, after her work with the ledgers was done, they would walk. Sometimes on the battlements, with the wind whipping the salt spray from the sea below, sometimes through the woods, where she pointed out the inefficiency of the logging operations with the same gentle precision she applied to everything. During these walks, the Duke of Blackmore would recede, and Crispin would emerge. He spoke of his childhood, of a father who saw emotion as a catastrophic failure of character, who taught him that duty was a shield and affection. He did not speak with self-pity, but with the detached curiosity of a scholar examining an ancient ruin. This was what made him. This was why he was the way he was. Selina in turn found herself speaking of things she had never told another soul. Of her own father, a gentle, scholarly man who had been ruined by a single bad investment, leaving her and her mother at the mercy of her aunt's cruel charity. She spoke of her love for numbers, for the clean, clear certainty of them, a refuge from the messy, unpredictable world of human emotions. I understand, he said one afternoon, as they stood on a cliff, overlooking the churning sea. A logic is a fortress, but it can be a cold one. Your Grace, she replied. A Crispin, he said. The word abrupt. She looked at him, confused. I beg your pardon. My name, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. If we are to be partners, you should use my name. At least when we are not in public. It was another milestone, another wall, crumbling. A Crispin. She tried. It felt both strange and right. And you must call me Selina. A Selina, he said. And the way he said it, quiet and low, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the wind. He began to appear in the library in the evenings. She would be reading, and he would enter, select a book, and sit in a chair across the room. They would not speak for hours, lost in their separate worlds, but the silence was no longer empty. It was companionable, a shared space. He was drawn to her presence, to the quiet calm she exuded, a balm to his own restless spirit. He was coming to rely on her, not just for her mind, but for the stillness she brought to his life. The formal announcement of their engagement was sent to the London papers. The wedding was set for a month's time. It was a practical, necessary step, but it felt like a public declaration of a truth that was already solidifying between them. They were a team, a partnership. One night a storm rolled in from the sea, lashing the castle with wind and rain. The sound of the shutters banging and the wind howling through the ancient stones was terrifying. Selina, unable to sleep, wrapped herself in a shawl and made her way to the library, seeking the comfort of its silent, book-lined walls. She found Crispin there, standing before the great fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was not drinking it, he was just staring into the flames. I could not sleep, she said by way of explanation. Nor I, he said. This was the night my mother died in a storm just like this. He confessed his fear, then. Not of the storm, but of what it represented. Loss, helplessness, the terrifying randomness of a world that could snatch away the people you loved without warning. He spoke of how he had sealed himself off from feeling, how he had mistaken control for strength, and solitude for safety. You are not alone, Crispin, she said, her voice a soft anchor in the tumult of the storm and his memory. She came and stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell him to be strong. She just stood with him in the dark, a silent, unwavering presence against the storm. He looked at her, then at her calm face illuminated by the firelight, and a truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had entered into this arrangement for practical reasons, to save his estate, to fulfill a contract. But somewhere along the way, in the quiet evenings and the windy walks, in the shared silences and the startling confessions, The nature of the bargain had changed. He had thought he was acquiring a duchess. He had not expected to find a friend. He had sought a solution to a problem. He had not expected to care whether she stayed. The realization was terrifying. It was a breach in his fortress, a crack in the ice that threatened to shatter everything. He had spent a lifetime avoiding this very feeling, this dangerous, volatile dependency on another human being. He had needed a wife by a deadline. That was the bargain, but the woman standing beside him in the firelight was no longer a solution. She was becoming the reason, and that, he knew, was a far more perilous contract than any solicitor could ever draft. The news of the impending wedding spread like wildfire through the county. With it came the inevitable tide of social obligation. Invitations arrived. Congratulatory notes, some sincere, some dripping with veiled curiosity, piled up on the hall table. The world, which had been held at bay by the high walls of Blackmore, was now insisting on being let in. It was Selina who managed it all, with the same quiet efficiency she applied to the ledgers. She composed the replies, she scheduled the necessary calls, she shielded Crispin from the worst of the flurry. But there was one guest they could not avoid. A note arrived on heavy, cream-colored stationery, sealed with a familiar, ostentatious crest, Lady Carmody. She wrote of her unbounded joy at the news, her delight that her dear, sweet Nia had found such a protector. She would be in the neighborhood, visiting a mutual acquaintance, and simply had to call to offer her felicitations in person. It was a demand masquerading as a request. We can refuse, Crispin said, his voice tight with anger as he read the letter. No, Selina replied, her own voice calm, though her stomach was churning. We cannot. To refuse would be to admit she has power over us. It would look like fear. We must see her. We must show her that her games have no effect here. It was the right move, the strategic move, and they both knew it. But as the day of her aunt's visit approached, a knot of dread tightened in Selina's chest. Lady Carmody arrived for tea, swathed in purple silk and dripping with malice. She swept into the morning room, which Selina had transformed from a gloomy, unused space into a bright, welcoming haven, and surveyed it with a critical eye. My dear Selina. How a rustic, she said, her gaze dismissing the simple elegance of the room. She turned to Crispin, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You have been so good to take her in hand. She always had such a simple tastes. The attack was subtle, a series of pinpricks designed to undermine Selina's new position, to remind her and everyone else of her humble origins. She complimented Selina Strachna of the new, elegant but understated gowns the seamstress had made, saying how clever it was to choose a style that so cleverly conceals a lack of dowry. Selina remained serene, pouring the tea with a steady hand, letting the insults glance off the armor of her composure. She had endured a lifetime of her aunt's barbs. They had lost their power to wound. Crispin, however, was less sanguine. He sat in stony silence, his jaw tight, his eyes like chips of ice. Every syrupy word from Lady Carmody's lips seemed to fuel his cold fury. Seeing that her veiled insults were having little effect on Selina, Lady Carmody changed tactics. She waited for a lull in the stilted conversation, then leaned forward, her expression a mask of faux concern. You know, your grace, she began. I have been so worried with the wedding so near, and Selina say, one does hear such whispers. Selina's blood ran cold. This was it. The real attack. What? Whispers, Lady Carmody? Crispin asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Oh, nothing, I am sure, her aunt trilled, waving a dismissive hand. Just old gossip. You know how people talk. About that little unpleasantness with the young lieutenant, back in Bath, before her father's misfortunes. A silly misunderstanding, of course, but reputations are such fragile things. I was so afraid it might surface and cause you embarrassment. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. There had been no lieutenant, no unpleasantness. There had been only books and numbers, and the quiet, lonely life of a girl who was too clever for her own good, but it was a brilliant lie, because it was impossible to disprove. It was a ghost, a smear of smoke that would cling to her name, a lie that ruined her. The room was utterly silent. Selina felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Crispin, expecting to see doubt, or worse, pity. She expected to see him weighing the liability, calculating the damage to his name. Instead, she saw a clarity in his eyes that was as sharp and bright as a shard of glass. He had been waiting for this. He had known this was coming. He turned his cool, analytical gaze on Lady Carmody, the lieutenant. He said, his tone conversational. "Ah, you must mean Lieutenant Davies of the 14th Light Dragoons." A tall fellow, sandy hair, a fondness for claret. Lady Carmody, caught off guard, but delighted that her bait had been taken, eagerly agreed. "A yes. That, say. You know of him. I know that the 14th Light Dragoons were serving in Portugal for the entirety of the year you speak of," a Crispin said, his voice dropping another 10 degrees. "And that Lieutenant Davies, who is a second cousin of mine, has never, in fact, been to Bath. A curious discrepancy. Wouldn't you agree?" He let the statement hang in the air, a guillotine blade suspended over Lady Carmodia's neck. He had not just defended Selina. He had exposed the lie with cold, irrefutable fact. He had done his research. He had anticipated the attack and prepared his defenses. He had protected her. Lady Carmodia's face a moment ago, triumphant, crumpled. She stammered, her eyes darting between Crispin's stony expression and Selina's pale, shocked face. "Ah, I must have been mistaken. The name, perhaps a Crispin said, his voice utterly devoid of warmth. He rose to his feet, a clear signal that the audience was over it. "Has been illuminating. To see you again, Lady Carmody, but I am sure you have other calls to make. Do not let us detain you." He was dismissing her like a recalcitrant scullery maid. The humiliation was absolute. Lady Carmody, defeated and exposed, scrambled for the tatters of her dignity. She shot Selina a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that promised this was not over, and fled the room. The silence that descended in her wake was profound. Selina sat frozen in her chair, the porcelain teacup rattling in its saucer as her hand trembled. He had not just believed her, he had armed himself on her behalf, quietly, without her even knowing. He had investigated her past, not to find fault, but to find the weapons he would need to defend her. How did you know?" she finally whispered. "I did not," he said, coming to stand behind her chair. His hand rested, for a brief, startling moment, on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it grounded her, stopped the room from spinning. But I know your aunt, and I know you." I made it my business to learn the facts of the year she mentioned. It was a simple precaution, a notice effort. The words he had spoken to her weeks ago, in the estate office, echoed in her mind. He noticed everything. He had seen the threat on the horizon, and had prepared for it, building a fortress of facts around her. "A thank you," as she said, the words wholly inadequate. "A Selina," he said, his voice losing its harsh edge. This is what partners do. They guard each other's backs. Your enemies are now my enemies. There is no need for thanks." But it was more than that. He had not just defended her honor, he had avenged it. The threat had come, the first real test of their alliance, and they had met it together. The victory felt solid, real, but Selina knew her aunt, a woman like that, publicly humiliated, did not simply retreat. She looked for a new weapon, a sharper one, and Selina had a dreadful feeling she knew exactly where she would strike next. The battle was won, but the war, for her reputation, for her very place in this house, had just begun. The incident with Lady Carmody, far from driving a wedge between them, solidified their alliance. It became the foundation of a new, deeper intimacy. The public humiliation and Crispin's swift, decisive defense of her had changed the atmosphere of the house. The staff who had witnessed the rout of the formidable Lady Carmody now looked at Selina with something approaching awe. She was not just the Duke has chosen, she was a woman who could hold her own, a woman the Duke himself would champion. She had earned her place. Their wedding was a quiet affair, held in the castle's ancient chapel, with only Mr. Hobbs and a beaming Mrs. Gable as witnesses. There was no grand celebration, no host of prying eyes. It was a solemn private exchange of vows, a legal and binding confirmation of the partnership they had already forged. When he slipped the simple gold band on her finger, his hand was steady, his gaze clear and direct. She was now Selina Abbott, Duchess of Blackmore. The title felt as foreign as her name had in the study all those weeks ago. After the ceremony, Crispin found her in the library, looking out the window at the sea. Are you regretting it? He asked, his voice quiet. No, she said, turning to face him. She was his wife now. His Duchess, I am, assessing my new position. The responsibilities have increased exponentially. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. And the assets? They are considerable, she admitted. But so are the liabilities. The greatest liability she knew was her own heart. In the weeks since her aunt's visit, something had shifted within her. The quiet respect she felt for Crispin, the gratitude for his protection, had begun to deepen into something warmer, more complex, and far more dangerous. She found herself watching him, noticing the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the rare moments when his guard dropped and a flicker of weariness showed in his eyes. She was beginning to see the man he had been before his father had tried to beat all the feeling out of him. She was falling in love with her husband. It was the most illogical, impractical, and terrifying thing she had ever done. Theirs was a contract, a partnership of minds. Emotion was not part of the bargain. To admit it, even to herself, felt like a betrayal of the very terms she had set. And so she threw herself into her work with renewed fervor. The ledgers were her shield, the numbers her defense against the chaos of her own feelings. Under her meticulous management, the estate began to flourish. The savings she identified were reinvested. The tenants, seeing real improvements and fair dealings, worked with a new sense of purpose. Blackmore, the sleeping giant, was indeed waking up, but Lady Carmody had not been idle. Having failed to destroy Selina's reputation, she sought a new avenue of attack. A letter arrived, not for Selina or Crispin, but addressed to the trustees of the late uncle's will, the very men whose deadline Crispin had been racing to meet. A copy, out of courtesy, was sent to Blackmore. Crispin read it in his study, his face growing harder and colder with every line. Selina, entering with the monthly accounts, saw his expression and knew that the other shoe had just dropped. What is it?" she asked. Without a word, he handed her the letter. It was from a solicitor, acting on behalf of an unnamed but concerned party. It was a petition. It alleged that the Duke of Blackmore's recent marriage was a sham, a fraudulent contract entered into for the sole purpose of circumventing the terms of the will. It painted Selina as a fortune hunter of low morals, a woman of no means or standing, who had entrapped the Duke. It called for a formal hearing to investigate the validity of the marriage, and if it were found to be a mere business arrangement, to nullify Crispin's inheritance of the trust. It was a brilliant, vicious move. It used their own honesty, the very foundation of their partnership, as a weapon against them. If they admitted the marriage was one of convenience, they would lose everything. If they lied and pretended it was a love match, they would be perjuring themselves, and the lie would be fragile and easily exposed. Her aunt had them trapped. She has used our own terms against us," Selina said, her voice a hollow whisper. The letter felt heavy in her hand, a death warrant for the new life she had just begun to build. She has Crispin agreed, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The hearing is in a month's time. In York. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackmore, Selina felt a wave of true despair. all her hard work, all the order she had brought from chaos, all the tentative shoots of warmth and life in the cold house, could all be undone by one piece of paper, one cruel, well-aimed lie. Though her voice lacked conviction, we could argue that a marriage of mutual benefit and respect is still a valid marriage, before a panel of trustees who believe marriage is for the procreation of heirs and the consolidation of property. Crispina's laugh was harsh and bitter. They will be looking for romance, for poetry, for all the things we explicitly agreed to forswear. Your aunt has chosen her battlefield well. He began to pace the room. A caged tiger. This was my fault. I underestimated her malice. I brought you into this, exposed you to this. I should have sent you away, given you a pension, let you live your life in peace. Ah, and what kind of life would that have been? Selina shot back, her spirit flaring in the face of his bleakness. Ah, life in hiding, always looking over my shoulder. A life as someone's charity case. No, I chose to stand with you. Crispin, I chose this fight, and I will not run from it now. Her fierce loyalty seemed to break through his despair. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a turmoil of emotions she could not name. But how do we fight it, Selina? The truth is not enough, and a lie is beneath you. Then we must find a different kind of truth, she said, her mind already racing, sifting through facts and possibilities, just as she did with her ledgers. The petition claims our marriage is a sham. It claims I am a fortune hunter. It claims there is no affection between us. Two of those are demonstrable lies. We must focus on the third affection, he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. How do we demonstrate affection, Selina? Are we to perform for them like actors in a play? No, she said. We will not perform. We will simply be. We will go to York, we will face them, and we will tell our story. Not the story of a contract, but the story of a partnership. The story of what we have built here, together. It was a slim hope, a fragile shield against the coming storm, but it was all they had. The month leading up to the hearing was the longest of Selina's life. A pall fell over Blackmore. The easy companionship between her and Crispin was replaced by a strained tension. They were both constantly aware of the performance they might soon be forced to give, and the awareness made them self-conscious, awkward. The silences in the library were no longer comfortable. They were filled with unspoken fears. The night before they were to leave for York, Selina found Crispin in the long gallery, standing once again before his mother's portrait. She would have known what to do, he said without turning. She navigated the treacherous waters of society with a grace I never learned. She would have told you to trust your heart, Selina said softly. He turned to her, then his face a mask of anguish. But my heart is the one thing I have never been taught to trust. My father called it a traitor, a purveyor of weakness. Your father was wrong, she said, her voice fierce. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him, forcing him to look at her. Your heart is not a weakness, Crispin. Your capacity for feeling, for loyalty, for righteous anger, that is the source of your strength. You defended me against my aunt, not because it was logical, but because it was right. You have cared for this estate and its people, not just as a duty, but with a deep, abiding passion. Do not let your father's ghost poison the best part of you. She reached out and, before she could lose her nerve, placed her hand on his chest, over the frantic beating of his heart. This is not a traitor. It is the truest thing about you. He looked down at her hand, then back up at her face, his eyes searching hers. The air between them crackled with a current of energy, so powerful it was almost visible. He was seeing her, not as his duchess, not as his accountant, but as the one person who had seen past the walls of ice and granite to the man trapped inside. Slowly he raised his own hand and covered hers, his fingers lacing through hers. Selina, he breathed, and her name was a prayer, a question, a confession. In that moment, she knew she could no longer hide behind the ledgers and the logic. The time for contracts and conditions was over. She loved him. And if they were to go down in flames in York, she would go down with the truth on her lips. If only for him to hear it once. "I'll love you, Crispina," she whispered. The confession, tearing from her with the force of a storm. Not as part of a bargain. Not out of gratitude. "I love you. And whatever happens tomorrow, that is a truth they can never take from us." His breath hitched. The carefully constructed walls of his control seemed to crumble to dust. He looked at her with a raw, desperate vulnerability that stole her breath away. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and discovery, of a thirst that had gone unslaked for a lifetime. It was the breaking of a dam, a flood of feeling held back for too long. It was harsh and clumsy and utterly, breathtakingly honest. It was the first real kiss of her life, and she met it with all the pent-up longing of her own heart. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, clinging to each other, as if to a lifeline in a raging sea. "Yeah," he started, his voice rough with emotion. Selina." But he couldn't say it. The words were too new, too frightening. The ghost of his father was too strong. It's all right," she whispered, her forehead pressed against his. "You don't have to say it, I know," and she did. She had felt it in his kiss, seen it in his eyes. The fortress had been breached, the ice had shattered. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together, not as partners in a contract, but as two people who had, against all odds, found each other in the dark. The courtroom in York was an imposing wood-paneled chamber, designed to intimidate. The three trustees sat on a raised dais, their faces stern and impassive. Lord Ashworth, the chairman, was a man whose jowls quivered with self-importance. The other two, a portly bishop and a cadaverous-looking barrister, looked equally uncharitable. Lady Carmody was not present, but her malice was a palpable presence in the room, channeled through her smirking solicitor, Mr. Vane. Selina and Crispin sat at a simple wooden table, alone. They had refused legal counsel. This was their story to tell. Mr. Vane opened the proceedings, his voice dripping with sanctimonious venom. He painted a picture of a desperate duke and a cunning, ambitious spinster. He presented their marriage as a cold, calculated transaction, reading from a fabricated informanta's report that detailed Selina's poverty and supposed lack of prospect. He ended with a flourish, demanding the trustees act to protect the sanctity of the late Lorda's will and the institution of marriage itself. Then Lord Ashworth turned his piggy eyes on Crispin. Your Grace, you have heard the allegations. Is it true that this marriage was one of a convenience, that you entered into it to satisfy the terms of the will bay?" Crispin rose. He looked, not at the trustees, but at Selina. A quick, reassuring glance. My lord," he began, his voice calm and steady. It is true that I was in need of a wife. It is true that my wife, the Duchess, was in a precarious position due to the actions of others. If that is what you mean by convenience, then yes. Our marriage was convenient." A gasp went through the small, crowded room. Mr. Vane smiled, a shark sensing blood, but, Crispin continued, his voice ringing with authority, to suggest that is the entirety of the matter is to mistake the first chapter of a book for the whole story. I did not marry a convenience, my lords. I married a woman of extraordinary intelligence, integrity, and courage. He then proceeded, in his calm, logical, devastatingly precise way, to describe what Selina had accomplished at Blackmore. He spoke of the ledgers, of the savings, of the restored morale of the tenants. He spoke of a house that had been filled with shadows and was now filled with light. He was not speaking of love, but of fact. He was presenting evidence of her worth, of her value as his partner. This woman, he concluded, his gaze sweeping over the trustees, has done more to secure the future of the Blackmore estate in 3 months than I had managed in 10 years. To call her a fortune hunter is a grotesque slander. The truth is, my lords, Blackmore is fortunate to have her. He sat down. The trustees were silent, their expressions unreadable. They had expected a denial or a romantic platitude. They had not expected a detailed financial report. Then Lord Ashworth turned to Selina. Madam, you have heard your husband. He speaks of you as one might speak of a particularly effective steward. Is that what this marriage is? A business partnership? This was the moment, the question on which everything turned. Selina rose, her heart hammering. She felt Crispin's hand find hers under the table, his grip firm and steady. My lord, she began, her voice clear and strong. I am an expert in business partnerships. I have studied contracts, balanced ledgers, and negotiated terms my entire adult life. I can assure you, what I have with my husband is not a business partnership. She paused, letting the words sink in. A business partnership is predicated on profit and loss. It is an exchange of goods and services. What I have with the Duke is an exchange of trust, an alliance of spirit. He speaks of my work with the estate ledgers, and yes, I am proud of that work. But the most important ledger I have helped to balance is not on paper. It is the one in his own heart, a heart that was taught to believe that duty was the only currency that mattered. As she turned to look at Crispin, her love for him shining in her eyes, plain for all to see. My husband did not offer me a contract, my lords. He offered me a sanctuary. And in return, I have tried to offer him the same. He believed he needed a duchess to manage his home. What he truly needed was someone to help him feel at home in his own life. To help him see that the strength he learned from his father is made complete by the warmth he inherited from his mother. She faced the trustees again, her voice ringing with passion. You ask if ours is a marriage of affection. I ask you, what greater affection can there be than to see a person for who they truly are, and to dedicate oneself to helping them become the best version of themselves? If that is not the very definition of a marriage, then I confess, I do not know what is. She finished, her chest heaving, the truth laid bare for all to see. She had not performed, she had confessed. A profound silence filled the room. The trustees looked at each other, their stern facades cracking. The portly bishop was openly dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Vane looked as if he had swallowed a wasp. Lord Ashworth cleared his throat. Mr. Vane, he said, his voice gruff, your petition is a disgrace, an offensive and baseless attack on the character of two admirable people. It is dismissed. He turned to Selina and Crispin, and for the first time, a glimmer of warmth appeared in his eyes. Your Grace, Duchess, my apologies for this ordeal, and my congratulations on a most effective partnership. The battle was over, they had won. That night, in their rooms at the inn, the relief was so overwhelming it was like a physical presence. They had faced the beast and slain it, not with lies, but with a truth that was deeper and more powerful than mere fact. Crispin stood by the fire, his back to her. What you said today, Selina, about my heart, about my Madeira, it was the truth, she said softly, coming to stand behind him. He turned, and the look on his face was one of awe and wonder. All the walls were gone, all the ice had melted. There was only Crispin, raw and vulnerable, and finally, free. I have been a coward, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have hidden behind my title and my duty, because I was terrified of this feeling. The one my father warned me against, the one you named today. The one I have felt for you since the moment you looked me in the eye and demanded the truth. Ahinda, he took her hands in his. I love you, Selina, not because you are my duchess, not because you saved my estate. I love you because you saved me from the cold, from the silence, from the man I was becoming. Oh, Crispin, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You do not have to say it because of what I said. Do not say it if it is only gratitude. Gratitude? He gave a short, incredulous laugh. Ah, my darling, stubborn, brilliant woman, is it gratitude that makes my heart stop when you walk into a room? Is it gratitude that makes the thought of a single day without you unbearable? No, it is not gratitude. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. You became the heart of this house. You became the heart of my life. I love you. That is the only truth that matters. As she melted against him, her own confession tumbling out. I stayed because I love you. I fought because I love you. It was always for you. He kissed her, then a kiss that was not of desperation, but of homecoming. It was a kiss of promises, made and kept, of a bargain that had been miraculously transformed by the strange alchemy of two lonely souls into the purest gold. The contract was fulfilled, the debt was paid, and the love story was just beginning. A year later, Selina, Duchess of Blackmore, stood on the battlements, the autumn wind whipping strands of hair from her neat chignon. The estate below was a patchwork of gold and green, the fields rich with the harvest, the village bustling with a prosperity it had not known in a generation. The cold house was a memory. Blackmore was now a home, filled with warmth and laughter and the sound of footsteps at Crispin's, hers, and the patter of the puppy he had insisted on getting her, a rambunctious creature that left muddy paw prints on the newly polished floors, much to Mrs. Gabelais' feigned dismay. Crispin came to stand beside her, wrapping a heavy wool cloak around her shoulders. He didn't speak, just slid his arm around her waist, pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the sea. A was reviewing the quarterly accounts, he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. We are showing a profit. A significant one. I know, she said, a smile playing on her lips. I wrote the report. He chuckled, a warm, easy sound that she would never tire of hearing. My brilliant Duchess. What would I ever do without you? You would manage, I suppose, she teased. But the lamps would be smokier, and the hay far more expensive. He turned her to face him, his expression suddenly serious. Would not manage, Selina. I would be lost. You are my compass, my true north. He kissed her. A slow, deep kiss, filled with the quiet certainty of a love that was no longer new and startling, but a deep, abiding part of the very air they breathed. Later that evening, they sat together in the library, a single ledger open on the table between them. It was their ritual, their quiet time. He was explaining a complex issue with a tenanta's water rights, and she was listening, her chin propped on her hand, her mind as engaged as his. He stopped mid-sentence and just looked at her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it made her heart ache. What is it? She asked. I was just thinking about that first day, he said. The woman who was sold to settle a debt, and the Duke, who tore up the paper and asked her name instead, she finished softly. He reached across the table and took her hand, the simple gold band warm against his skin. It was the best bargain I ever made. Selina smiled, her heart full. The world had tried to write her story as a tragedy, a cautionary tale of a woman treated as less than nothing. But a man who saw more, who demanded more, had given her a blank page, and together they had written a love story. He had refused to buy her, but in the end he had given her everything. She was not a replacement, not a solution, not a bargain discharged. She was the woman who stayed. She was home.